Gustavo. He's going to present a paper called Mutual Recognition as a Normative Foundation of Human Rights, Some Doubts.
Thank you, Felipe. Good afternoon to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee, Professor Alessandro Pinzani, for inviting me to hold this talk. And second, I would like to thank you all for taking the time to be here, and I hope you enjoy a good week of discussion and debate. So, my paper is called Mutual Recognition as a Normative Foundation for Human Rights, Some Doubts. First of all, because I do have some great doubts. I will try to present it as doubts I have, as some maybe objections that I think that are well placed against the theory of recognition, mainly by Humboldt. And I would like to say that this is sort of a work in progress, but I will try to make these doubts at the end understandable for all. So before I get to the point, I would like to start by saying that discussions about the relation between recognition and human rights usually they revolve around the idea of a compatibility, or for that matter, an incompatibility between minority rights and the universal framework attributed to human rights. And this seems to be something that cuts across the philosophical divide from texts like Charles Taylor's Multiculturalism, written in the early 90s, and from a Hegelian perspective, to more recent texts, like, for example, Killian McBride's book about recognition, which adopts a Kantian perspective on recognition and was written in 2013. It's like almost 25 years of debate, and the problem seems to be posed in roughly the same way. So, what it really makes it important to me is that it seems to exist in both sides of that philosophical divide, sort of taken for granted incompatibility between minority rights and universal principles. And in this sense, both Taylor and McBride deal with some problems, and they deal with their respective problems in their respective models, which are way more complex than I will be able to do justice to here. But both of them deal with the problem of human rights or minority rights and the framework of recognition from that viewpoint that there is a primary incompatibility, or at least a primary tension between recognition and universal principles, or between minority rights and universal principles, and special rights and universal principles. So, if we take Taylor's idea of recognizing French-speaking minority rights in Canada, we arrive at the image of rights that are so important, so inviolable to the ones who claim those rights, that they should be taken as if they were rights that should be given to all, that should be assured to all human beings, and therefore they should be treated as if they should be treated as if they were human rights. McBride, on the other side, he's well aware of the tensions that exist between dignity recognition and esteem recognition, to use his vocabulary, and when he does that, he ends up defending a framework of rights recognition, of dignity recognition, against esteem recognition, because based on Pierre Bourdieu's theory of distinction, McBride notes that, yeah, sometimes the drive to achieve esteem forms of recognition can lead to the establishment of new distinctions or new forms of subordination or hierarchies. So the problem is that both of them try to resolve tensions between recognition, between this compatibility of recognition and human rights, but none of them actually discusses the normative foundations of human rights and its conceptual implications to recognition theories. Rather, that is correct, this rough interpretation I'm based here, if this is correct, they deal with practical political implications that arise with the need to accommodate difference within a vaguely conceived framework of universal human rights. And this vaguely conceived framework of human rights is based on a general notion of equal dignity that is in the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so on. But then these theories, both these models from Taylor and McBride, they seem to be trapped in this dilemma of having to choose, after all, what is more valuable, if individual, minority and special rights or the universal framework of positive right. Furthermore, in being trapped in this accommodation dilemma, they do not take the further step to ask if mutual or reciprocal recognition from a theoretical point of view, from the normative point of view, can be understood as a framework for human rights, or even if recognition fosters human rights. And that is the kind of question I will try to discuss here, and at this moment it should be very clear that I will discuss that from a rather normative point of view. And in order to do that, I would like to take a recent, I think it's a very recent, objection Georg Lohmann made to Axel Honneth in a recent discussion published this year in a book called Is Self-Realization Institutionalizable? Or something like that. And in my presentation, I want to discuss Lohmann's objection to Honneth, and to do that, I will take the following steps. First, I will present Lohmann's criticism of Honneth's theory of social freedom, showing how he correctly identifies not a practical political tension between forms of recognition, but a normative tension between the I and the we of freedom, as Honneth puts it. Second, I will try to propose a defense of Honneth's notion of social freedom, recurring to the use he makes of the notion of cooperation, but in the final step, which I hope will prove understandable and convincing, I will try to show that Honneth's model can indeed be corrected, and I'll try to do that referring to some less known texts from French sociologist Émile Durkheim. So, in the first part, that is this human rights and moral, I start by saying that contrary to Taylor and McBride, Lohmann takes his point of departure not the theories of recognition, not the idea of recognition, but exactly the idea of human rights. So my own point of departure is Lohmann's objection to Honneth, Honneth the later, cannot properly account for the fact that within modern societies, conceptions of individual self-realization must, on the one hand, be conceived as independent of and eventually protected from collective relations to the community, of which, on the other hand, individuals depend for their actual implementation, for the actual implementation of that conceptions of self-realization. And I think this is a especially sharp objection to Honneth, because in his recent model, as Lohmann also points out, Honneth takes individual self-realization to be rather a moment of an ethically stouter or stronger form of life he calls social freedom. Human rights, so Lohmann affirms, together with all the elements of social life that are realized in the sphere of positive right, are deemed the possibility of freedom, in opposition to the reality of freedom, which are the two subtitles of sections of Honneth's book. So the problem here, according to Lohmann, is that human rights, which are a particular class of moral rights, are oriented by the positive conception of right, which means that their protection and their core definition cannot rest upon purely moral perspectives, although these are their point of view, but their point of departure, but they need the positive framework of right. So this rather complicated status, and I'm following Lohmann's definition here, echoes a problem that is present from the very outset in the definition of human rights. For if they are taken to be universal, egalitarian, and categorical, at the same time, it remains unclear if those contents, these universal, egalitarian, and categorical contents, they refer to a pre-state form of rights or to a political community regulated through positive rights. That is, if rights, when we're talking about human rights, if they are rather moral or juridical. So, in Honneth, much to Lohrmann's dismay, the two things get intermingled, indeed, but only to allow at the highest sphere of freedom, social freedom, for trespassing of the positive structures of the right, allowing Honneth at the end to take structures and political structures like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as signs of modern learning processes of cultural resources that feed transnational ideas of solidarity. At the end, Honneth wants to see such elements as the Universal Declaration as a sign of history, as he puts in a response to criticism. So what is lost, according to Lohrmann, is the critical character of projects of self-realization of which human rights are a particular strong form. For human rights not only are born as a defense against violence, against evil doings for some groups of people and so on, but they are also institutional arrangements and constructions that assume other humans as bearers of rights. In this sense, human rights immediately protect human beings, but also they do that by means of necessary reciprocal commitment. So, if moreover, this reciprocal commitment necessarily demands the existence of positive right, exactly because the protections assured by human rights are of that special kind which generally comes to the fore when individual life conducts are threatened, and life conducts are very important here. So accordingly, the critical potential is realized as the enabling of self-realization in one's life conduct, also when this implies that they are rights against the community. So goes Lohrmann. And, but the problem, he goes further, is a little more complex, because there seems to be, and this is well documented in the secondary literature about Honneth, but there seems to be a change in the architecture of Honneth's theory of recognition from struggle for recognition to freedom's right. For in the first book, in Struggle for Recognition, self-realization, and this is important to Lohrmann, self-realization was still taken to be a final goal of social interaction, whereas in freedom right, that is not the case. In this last book, the participation in democratic public life is mediated through the pursuing of shared goals. Not only the formal structure of positive right is substituted as a binding force of ethical life for a political culture of solidarity, but public life itself is not conceived as an arena of struggle. So, at the end, Lohrmann also compares Honneth's idea of transnational solidarity with Aristotle's community of the good citizens and so on. But at the end, affirm Lohrmann, as it's rather modeled as a community of the good-willed, it can only be a locus of self-realization as long as self-realization is already embedded in the community. So at this second level, at this second complex of problems, what is lost is the fact that there are mediating arenas of social struggle, and the possibility of struggle is also left in a blind alley. So we have, from the viewpoint of the theory of recognition, a deeper problem here, because besides the mentioned tension between the normative dimensions of freedom as moral freedom and as social freedom, the second objection shows that there is also a difficulty in Honneth's recent theory of recognition to address the social conflict and, more importantly, its consequences. But otherwise, in moving away from a theory of the struggle for recognition towards a normative reconstruction of mutual recognition, Honneth loses sight of the critical dimension brought about by the mediating elements of social struggle, as is the case for positive right. So to summarize, there is these 2 points of critique in Lohmann's objection. The first one, Honneth loses sight of the critical potential that exists in Honneth's structure lower sphere of recognition, and on the second hand, there is a blind side to the social conflict arenas. But this leads me to the question if a theory of mutual recognition taught as a form of implicit reciprocity can safeguard the moment of individual self-realization. And so I come to the second part of my presentation. But before I go to Honneth's argument properly, I just want to say that I don't think this is the same as a very well documented and discussed hypothesis and thesis that here in Brazil is pretty well represented by Professor Edenilson Velli and Professor Julio Salles de Mello about a political deficit in Honneth's argument. I think that Lohmann's point here seems to be rather that the justification of human rights is seen by Honneth either as less important than social norms of reciprocal recognition or as resulting from a learning process that refrain from relating to social struggle and even more for understanding that learning processes should better be explained as institutionalization of claims made through social struggle. If that may seem that Honneth is abandoning his initial interactionist assumptions about social conflict, the ones based on George Herbert Mead's theory of interaction, and therefore he's adopting a more Hegelian approach, for sure this is correct, but I would also point that this doesn't mean that he is abandoning a sociological theory after all, but he has changed the sociological presupposition or the social scientific presuppositions of his model in order to accommodate what he calls a normative functionalism or functionalism. I don't know how to pronounce that, but in order to accommodate that within the model, Honneth now tries to explain society not from the point of departure of social conflict, but from the point of departure of social reproduction. And this is a very important move within the architecture of his theory. And this is clear when he talks about his attempt to discuss work and recognition. And he says, no, social integration is as important as system integration to understand social conflict and so on. But in combining reproduction and interaction, Honneth has the intention to demonstrate how institutional life could be conceived as a necessary means for the realization of freedom. That is, the core of the idea of social freedom is that the social objective reality of institutions also has to be conceived as a form of freedom. But these requirements of the theory require also that there is institutional practices and routines, which are very important also, that regulate the expression of one's own goals as much as her perception of the articulation of someone else's goals. Through such recognitional institutions, subjects learn to identify the complementarity of objective interests they share with other members of society, thus perceiving society as a collective enterprise at the level of its guiding values. But when Honneth comes to discuss labor market, he gives a further twist to this idea, as he says he does not want to rely on institutional structures that could realize the implicit norms and values of, in the case of market, of production, but in the family and in democratic sphere, that is the same. He doesn't want to rely on institutional structures, but assume there is alone norms and values that must be accounted for in the analysis of normative contents of markets and family and democracy. This means, after all, that the pursuit of self-realization depends on a previous set of non-written rules that assert that economic exchange, personal relations, and democratic culture are understood by its participants, as the legitimate way of fulfilling their mutual dependence. This is why cooperation is so important, because cooperation is, after all, the value that sustains this recognition of practices and routines as institutions. And this, after all, leads Humboldt to the further and final assumption that within social freedom there is no reconciliation between subjects, but between subjective freedom and objective reality. In doing that, Humboldt justifies why there is this expansion of the I into the we, and why it's important that we realize that the sphere of social freedom has a wider character from the point of view of freedom than compared to that of reflexive or moral freedom. But at the same time, it also makes clear that, yeah, as Lohmann said, the provocative spite of positive rights are effectively lost, since the conciliation intended is that between subjective freedom and objective reality. That there is no space anymore for that self-realization as a form of right. So to summarize, that in this change of heart that Humboldt went through from struggle to recognition, for recognition to freedom's right, that is a change of heart from conflict to cooperation as the departing point for explaining society. Humboldt moves from his three original spheres of struggle for recognition, love, rights, and public esteem to three spheres of cooperative action, personal relations, cooperative functions, and democratic ethical life. And I think that is very interesting that in the former division in struggle for recognition, the state had a central role as the locus of one form of recognition. And in the second tripartition Humboldt does, the state has no proper role, although it can relate to each one of these spheres. It can regulate forms of personal relations, as in same-sex marriage. It can, of course, relate labor relations within the market, and it must regulate at some level, but not the level Humboldt wants, democratic public life. So the problem is we see that the state is important here, and it's important for each one of the spheres, but it's not really that important that it has a proper place. Because remember, it's practices and routines, norms and values that account for the orientation of action. So again, the question is, what do we do with the state? Or to make a more specific question that depends on that, how do we guarantee that the moment of individuality is not a mere possibility of freedom, a lesser stage compared to the reality of social freedom? And here, in this last part of my presentation, is where I think we could really use some help from Emile Durkheim's political economy and moral philosophy. So, as is well known, Durkheim had written the division of labor in society, and in the division of labor in society, he defended mainly the thesis that throughout the historical process of division of labor, of specialization of labor activity, it creates the same process, the very process of division of labor creates solidarity, but not in the sense of empathy, but in the sense of a binding form, a binding force for specialized functions within modern societies. But to a lesser extent, Durkheim also relies on a second assumption, and this second assumption is that human beings need to take part in a division of labor because of their natural incompleteness. So, the very cause of the division of labor is understood as the need of interaction and human incompleteness, but the result is twofold. On the one hand, people acknowledge their dependence towards the others, but on the other hand, they see as their task to work towards the satisfaction of others' needs. And so the division of labor disguises a mediated horizon of experiences that result from that division of labor. But in a further step, Durkheim also notes that proper to this kind of solidarity that he calls organic solidarity, there the acknowledgement of functional differentiations that are proper to individualistic forms of being, individualistic forms of realize or implement or do our works within these modern societies. And that, for him, in his vocabulary, appears as the code of the human dignity. But this is more than that. This is the recognition of the central value of the individual potential for conducting life as one's individuality or as one's desires tend to do that. And this is the point that Durkheim tried to prove the rest of his life. When he wrote The Division of Labor in Society, he was accused by reviewers to be ignoring the human, the individual dimension of social interaction and to be rather a collectivist. And he spent years and years saying, no, it's not that. I was actually trying to say the contrary. And in his lectures on sociology, I don't know the original French name, but I know that in Portuguese there are lectures in sociology, in English or something else. In German, it's the physics of costumes. It's not a good title, actually. But then at these lectures, which Durkheim gave for the last 10 years or 15 years of his life, he was confronted with the task of explaining how exactly the development of independence, the individual independence, could also result in the establishment of individuality as the core value of modern societies. But he sees himself compelled to do that without denying the role of the state, because the historical experience shows that at the same time the state and individuality grow. It's like an empirical point of view as far as Durkheim goes, empirical. So he intends, and this is the final point I want to make, he intends to show that the institutions, or the institution of individual rights is actually due to the state. And although this statement must seem oddly trivial at first sight, Durkheim's usage of it hides the idea that the establishment of subjective rights can only occur because the very idea of individuality was lent a sacred status, thanks to the effects of the division of labor, which is a human process of creating society and so on. Thus the state does not attribute natural rights to its citizens, that is his point. It rather elaborates and establishes then the rights of individuals as an ideal, and an ideal that was born within human interaction, human reciprocal interaction. This is especially important in as far as it shows that Durkheim is not taking as his point a functionalist explanation from the division of labor, one that only highlights its importance to the reproduction of society, but also adding to it a normative dimension of trying to show that, yeah, it proves or it shows that we have a space for an ethical form of life here, this ethical respect for individual forms of life conduct. I think this is at some length, some great length I would say, what Honneth intends to do. But Honneth tries to do that without relying on social mechanisms, as Durkheim does. And Durkheim does that relying on a mechanism, not of division of labor, but of the state as an organ who centralizes and filters diverse life conduct orientations and the whole craziness that inhabits society, and tries to reflexively establish it as forms of respect for individual claims for life conduct. Okay, I don't think it's, I don't know if it's okay to respond Lohnmann's objection to Honneth with that reference to Durkheim, because
After all, Durkheim was not really preoccupied or worried about human rights, although in his text, Individualism and in the Intellectuals, he discusses the Dreyfus affair, and he goes at some efforts to discuss that. But I think that it's a way to prove that within a framework of reciprocal or of social freedom and reciprocal institutions of recognition, there is also a form to safeguard this dimension of respect for the individuality. I think that is what Durkheim tries to do, and maybe that can contribute for this discussion. So, thank you for all for listening, and sorry for overflowing the time.